Good evening and welcome to week 7 of Choices, Foreign Policy Issues in the 2020 Election. My name is Matthew Hughes and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we're so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council, as you may know, strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. We invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other sessions in the Choices Election Issues series, other upcoming events, and how to join as a member on our website at irckc.org. The 2020 presidential election will present the American people with consequential choices around international challenges and the future of US foreign policy. In these 8 weeks leading up to November 3rd, we're talking with notable experts on foreign policy issues relevant to this year's election and what comes next. Rather than advocate a particular approach or outcome, the Nonpartisan Choices series is meant to inform voters through a presentation of historical context and a detailed examination of the foreign policy platforms of the major party candidates. We welcome diverse perspectives and encourage the community to join us in meaningful discourse around these issues of global importance. And we hope you'll engage that way with us this evening as we explore Iran, North Korea, and nuclear proliferation. We welcome your questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share the other conversations in the Choices series as we consider a range of critical foreign policy issues. We are grateful to our sponsors who have made this evening's program and the Choices series possible. In particular, we thank supporting series sponsors Nancy C. Messer, the University of Missouri, and Buttonwood Financial Group. We also appreciate the contribution of sustaining conversation sponsors Avila University and Cyprian Simkowitz and Jerry White. Thank you for recognizing the timeliness and relevance of these conversations. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us navigate the conversation. Dr. Cooper Drury is the Senior Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Science and Professor of Political Science at the Truman School of Public Affairs at the University of Missouri. He earned his BA and MA from Michigan State University and his PhD from Arizona State University. His primary research and teaching interests focus on foreign policy. Specifically, he studies the causes, outcomes, and consequences of economic sanctions. He has authored or co-authored 2 books, an award-winning textbook, and over 24 articles and chapters. In his field, Professor Drury served as editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy Analysis and as the 2016 International Studies Association program co-chair. Cooper, please take it away. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Matthew. But it seems like there's quite a mouthful of my title there. My apologies. So I'm very happy to introduce Suzanne DiMaggio. She's the Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she focuses on US foreign policy toward the Middle East and Asia. She's one of the foremost experts and practitioners in diplomatic dialogues with these countries that have limited or no official relations with the United States, particularly Iran and North Korea. And that's quite a feat, I want to note as a side point, because it's one thing to be an expert and know much about countries with which we have relations. It's an entirely different one to know as much as Suzanne does about Iran and North Korea. For nearly 2 decades, she has led these different level of diplomatic conversations, track 1.5, track 2 conversations to help policymakers identify pathways for diplomatic progress on a range of issues, including regional security, nonproliferation, terrorism, and governance. So with that, you're really here to hear, you are here to listen to Suzanne. So I'm going to turn it over to her. She's going to speak for a little bit, and then we're going to open up for questions. Suzanne.
I remembered to unmute myself. Hooray. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you. Let me thank Matthew and the International Relations Council for having me and inviting me today. I only wish I could be there in person. I've never visited Kansas City, but I look forward to doing it soon. Hopefully, we'll be able to do that. So my remarks today are going to focus on and assess current U.S. approaches to dealing with the nuclear programs of North Korea and Iran. I'll begin by discussing the current state of play with both countries. I'll add in some perspectives from Pyongyang and Tehran that I think we should consider. And then I'm going to conclude with some brief thoughts on potential ways forward. But before moving ahead, I think it's worth pointing out that the cases of North Korea and Iran are often mentioned together in the same breath, but in reality, they are quite different. As an American who has had rare opportunities to travel to both countries on multiple occasions, I have experienced these differences firsthand. For the purposes of today's discussion, it is particularly important to note that North Korea possesses nuclear weapons and Iran has never crossed that threshold. Iran is a party to the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, commonly known as the NPT. North Korea withdrew from that treaty in 2003. And as a sidebar, the NPT is an international treaty whose objective is to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and weapons technology, to promote cooperation in the peaceful use of nuclear energy, and to further the goal of achieving nuclear disarmament and complete disarmament. North Korea announced its withdrawal from the NPT in January 2003, and since that time, it has successfully tested advanced nuclear devices. Now, in the past, Iran did pursue secret nuclear activities in violation of its NPT terms, but a U.S. National Intelligence Estimate, also known as an NIE, in 2007 concluded that Iran halted its nuclear weapons program in 2003. Another difference is Iran allows inspectors from the IAEA to monitor its nuclear activities to ensure it remains peaceful, and North Korea does not permit any inspections on its soil. So that's just some background, and now I'll move on to the current state of play with North Korea. So we're coming up on 2.5 years since Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un met in Singapore for their first summit. That was in June 2018. A second summit was held in Hanoi, Vietnam in February 2019 with lackluster results. This was followed by a handshake between Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim at the DMZ in June 2019. Letters between the leaders have been exchanged along the way. And while these interactions have decreased tensions, these encounters have not produced any concrete progress on rolling back North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. In fact, throughout this period, the North Koreans have been quite busy, launching a series of short-range ballistic missile tests. And in this mix, they've rolled out several new weapons programs. You may have seen in the news just a couple of weeks ago, they held a big military parade in Pyongyang, during which they displayed advanced military hardware, including what appeared to be a massive new intercontinental ballistic missile. It's unclear if it was just a mock-up or if it was the real thing. But it's notable that the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency has estimated that the North Koreans have produced enough fuel for a dozen or more nuclear weapons during this period. So over the past couple of years, U.S. engagement with North Korea has focused nearly exclusively on Pyongyang's nuclear and missile program, at the expense, I would say, of exploring efforts to establish peace and make progress on other issues. The U.S. at the Hanoi summit insisted that North Korea fully denuclearize, give up its entire nuclear program, as well as their missile program, their biological weapons program, and their chemical weapons program before they would receive any concessions. The North Koreans, of course, did not agree with this approach, And that is where it's left us today, where we're currently in a stalemate. So if the purpose of the current approach was to constrain the development of North Korea's nuclear missile program, we have to say it's been a failure. Kim Jong-un has nothing concrete to show in terms of economic progress for his engagement with the US. And this, of course, is a problem for Kim. But what he can show is clear advancement in North Korea's weapon capabilities. Now, the view from Pyongyang, I just want to put forward 2 points that the North Koreans have conveyed in discussions that I think carry important implications for US policymaking. The first is that they see the US as an existential threat to their regime survival. They see their nuclear weapons and missile programs as the only reliable means to deter an attack from the US and the only source of security against regime change. They've concluded that the United States will not attack a country that has nuclear weapons. They point to the examples of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya and Saddam Hussein in Iraq as cautionary tales. The second point is related to this. I call it the rejection of the Libya-style approach. And that refers to Muammar Gaddafi. He gave up his nuclear program famously, and then he was killed anyway. So the North Koreans have drawn lessons from this. They see the current US approach to negotiations as a Libya-style approach, which insists that they fully denuclearize before receiving concessions. They say they will not agree to a process that provides no security assurances to safeguard their regime and no opportunities to address economic challenges early in that process. So given these perspectives, it's clear to me that the current US negotiating stance towards North Korea is flawed. The refusal to consider concessions such as limited sanctions relief as part of a negotiation process, I think, is a miscalculation, and it's actually an obstacle to testing whether diplomacy can work. Granting limited relief of sanctions in exchange for comparable concessions on their side is precisely in line with the purpose of levying sanctions in the first place, and that's to bring about changes in bad behavior and threatening policies. So the limits of the current approach, I think, have become very clear following the pageantry of 2 summits and a handshake at the DMZ, also a series of what's been known as love letters. We now need serious diplomacy to manage the uncertainties ahead. Now let me turn to Iran and the current state of play with Tehran. After 35 years of hostilities, the US and Iran reached a nuclear deal, officially known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also the JCPOA. That happened in July 2015. This was a deal that was the result of diplomacy between China, France, Russia, the UK, Germany, the US, and of course, Iran. The only goal of the deal is to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear bomb. The focus is on this one issue because it was deemed the most critical issue. It is not meant to cover Iran's missile program or its regional activities. The deal reduced Iran's uranium enrichment capacity, which is the material used to make bombs. It stretched out that period for making a bomb from 3 months to 12 months. And it also eliminated the plutonium path to a bomb. Plutonium is another material to make nuclear weapons. And it has placed Iran under the strongest nuclear inspection system ever negotiated. And in exchange for Tehran rolling back its nuclear program, the US and the world powers, including our closest allies, agreed to suspend some economic sanctions. The US withdrew from the JCPOA in May 2018 and then reinstated sanctions against Iran, which brought the US out of compliance with the deal. As a result of this move, the international consensus against Iran that took years of diplomacy to build has now disintegrated. The US now stands virtually alone in its maximum pressure campaign against Iran. And in the process, we unfortunately have alienated ourselves from our closest allies, we've also forfeited a great deal of negotiating leverage as well as moral authority. Now, let me move on to the view from Iran and present two views that Iranians have conveyed in informal discussions. The first is they point to US policy incoherence. There is confusion among Iranian officials about the objectives of the US's maximum pressure policy. They see the US withdrawal from the deal as an all-out war on their economy. And these impacts have been quite serious. They've plunged the Iranian economy into a recession, especially during this time of COVID. The results have been quite harsh. The US has talked about wanting a better deal, but has not put forward a plausible plan for how to get there. This has led many Iranians to conclude that the actual objective of our withdrawal from the deal is regime change. The second point relates to nonproliferation. The US withdrawal from the deal has led to a debate within Iranian policymaking circles over whether Iran should resume a full-scale nuclear program, including an immediate withdrawal from the JCPOA and possibly even withdrawing from the NPT. There are no indications that Tehran is moving in this direction, but we should be concerned that the current policy is causing some in Iran to rethink their commitments to the NPT. And the fact remains that we're witnessing more proliferation now from Iran, not less. Iran has now expanded its enrichment activities. It has accelerated the development of centrifuges, which produces uranium enrichment. It has increased the stockpiles of the uranium and potentially have shortened the breakout time. And while Iran has not yet entered the realm of a serious proliferation risk, things are clearly heading in the wrong direction. So to conclude, given the perspectives I have just outlined, it comes as no surprise that the current approaches to both North Korea and Iran are not working. Simply put, the policy goals are not realistic. It's all coercion. There's no realistic diplomatic off-ramps that could lead to sustained negotiations. In the case of North Korea, I think the leader-to-leader approach between President Trump and Kim Jong-un has been a breakthrough. There's no doubt about that. But as we've learned, this breakthrough will only take us so far. North Korea continues to make steady advances in its nuclear program and its missile program. And we could easily slip back into a ratcheting up of hostilities quite quickly, including once again spiraling toward military confrontation, either by design or more likely by accident. So it's clear we need a coherent strategy and pragmatic goals to avoid that situation from happening. In the case of Iran, diplomacy did work. Major powers cooperated to peacefully resolve an issue that all viewed as a potential threat, Iran's nuclear program. Following our withdrawal from the JCPOA, as many predicted, we're now locked in a cycle of escalation that could lead to violent conflict. My view is we should return to the JCPOA, join our allies and partners in an effort to reach a similar deal to extend the JCPOA, and then pursue negotiations on the range of issues we have with Tehran that are undermining American interests. I haven't touched on what we likely could expect from a second Trump administration or a Biden administration, but I'm happy to do so in the Q&A if there's interest. So I look forward to your questions and comments.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. So I'm going to start off with one question that I am going to ask you about the Trump and Biden, what you might think happened. The first one is that I've wondered about, Buena de Mesquita has made an argument that there are two different types of regimes. One, in effect, that you can put simply sort of trust, so they are worth negotiating with. And then another one that is not trustworthy. He specifically used this in reference to terrorist groups, but it can easily be applied to state actors. So following from that, which you might say is a non-trustworthy regime, say like North Korea, if they are that, you don't negotiate, you would just try to say contain. Whereas if you had a trustworthy regime, one that you could, again, that there was a certain level of trust they would follow through, that it is worth negotiating. And I've heard people talk about the Iran and North Korea sort of fit this model, that the Iranians were following through with their part of the bargain. And if you go back to the agreed framework under the Clinton administration, the North Koreans didn't. They kept violating the agreement. So what do you think of that? Do you think that is it valuable to negotiate with the North Koreans, or is containment a better approach? And what about Iran?
Well, it's a very good question. And I think in negotiations with adversaries like Iran and North Korea, trust should not be a factor. I don't think it's a realistic factor. My approach would be distrust and verify. And in the case of Iran, that's exactly what we did. We didn't get to a place of trust with the Iranians by any measure, but we were able to reach a deal where both sides could say they won. That is a major feat of diplomacy. But the verify part is what's important. Part of that deal, the major part of the deal, was the very intrusive monitoring and inspection system that was put into place, where that put Iran's nuclear program under surveillance 24/7. There are IAEA inspectors on the ground in Iran as we speak. They've never left since the nuclear deal went into effect, and there are also cameras and other technologies that can detect uranium enrichment if it were to happen. So that is how you negotiate with an adversary. You reach agreement, you reach compromise, you make some concessions, you get to a point hopefully where you both can say you got what you wanted, but you also put in place mechanisms to make sure people are sticking with the deal. And you're right, the Iranians did stick with the deal. It was we who fell out of compliance. They didn't start coming out of their commitments until a year after we left the deal.
Yeah.
Now, in the case of North Korea, it is quite different. I would argue that the agreed framework, even though the North Koreans did cheat, they sent a space vehicle, launched a space vehicle, but we also didn't follow through on our commitments to the agreed framework. We were supposed to deliver some light water reactors to North Korea so that they could start producing peaceful nuclear energy. And we dragged our feet. Congress dragged the feet. So we were also out of compliance too. Again, my approach with a country like North Korea, where there's so much deep mistrust, is you have to be prepared for missteps, setbacks, be flexible, but continue on a path of negotiation, because once, as we've seen with North Korea, once those talks were cut off, what did we see happen? When we look back at that period of the agreed framework, the North Koreans virtually stopped enrichment. They virtually stopped their plutonium program. And once we got back out of the deal, that's when they started ramping things up. And now they've tested 6 nuclear weapons, tested a whole bunch of ICBMs and short-range missiles. So I think it wasn't practical. We couldn't contain North Korea's nuclear program. The best we got is when we were in a deal and negotiating with them. So I think we need to get back to that place of real negotiations. Of course, North Korea is a different place now. Their program looks to be unstoppable. So I think we have to turn our attention to other goals like de-escalation, risk management, maybe starting a process of some disarmament, getting inspectors back on the ground, things like that.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, once that nuclear genie is out of the bottle, it doesn't go back in. Well, so real briefly, we're starting to get a couple of questions, but I'm dying to know what you think of the two candidates' approach, what we might expect from President Trump or Vice President Biden.
Great. I'm glad you asked that, because I couldn't fit it in the time allotted for my opening remarks. So I think, if Trump is reelected, given what I just outlined, my assessment of both counts are not success stories, let's put it that way. His administration will need to reassess options and adjust their negotiating positions if they want to succeed. And to have any chance of making progress, they're going to have to set achievable goals. They're going to have to transition to an action for action approach. We do one thing, North Koreans do one thing, and we keep doing that. We set incremental benchmarks, and we're flexible to manage the setbacks. He'll also need to empower real negotiators to conduct real diplomacy, preferably quiet diplomacy, tone the tweets down and all that stuff, and let the negotiators and diplomats get to work. So I guess I would pose a question back. Do we think that the Trump administration in a second term will have the discipline and vision to extrapolate these lessons and course correct along these lines? I'm a little skeptical. I'm actually very skeptical. Also on Iran, Trump recently said he would reach a deal with Iran just 3 weeks after his reelection. I think that also is an unlikely scenario, but Trump could very well want to pursue a deal at some point with the Iranians in his second term. He may show a willingness to shift from a hardline stance. That might be motivated by his desire to finally outdo Obama on his signature foreign policy achievement and strike a deal with the Iranians. So I guess, again, I'm very skeptical about that. I think he will be, in a second administration, be more emboldened just to double down on the current approach. Now, if Biden prevails, we have to think about what he'll be entering when if he becomes president in January 2021. There are going to be urgent priorities on the domestic front, the triple crises of COVID, economic downturn, and the racial justice crisis that we're facing. And put on top of this, China will be the dominant foreign policy agenda, addressing climate change and so forth. But if you look at Vice President Biden's recent writings, he wrote in Foreign Affairs recently that he would rejoin the JCPOA and then use that renewed commitment to pursue diplomacy with our allies to extend it and then push back against Iran over its destabilizing regional activities. So that's the course he has set, which is quite different than what the Trump administration is doing. On North Korea, he has been a little more circumspect. He has said that he wouldn't rule out meeting with Kim Jong-un face to face, but there has to be a strategy in place first. There has to be a period of negotiation where the diplomats get together and work out a plan. That has been missing in the current approach. So you could call that a precondition or a prerequisite, but that sounds right to me. Not rule out meeting Kim Jong-un, but make it clear we need to have a diplomatic strategy before that meeting can take place. So those are the general parameters that I've learned.
Excellent, thanks. So we've got a few questions, and just for all the folks listening in, I'm going to hunt and pick through these so they won't necessarily be in order. My apologies. The one that I think might be most interesting is the person asking points out that there are going to be people listening in who aren't just, as they put it, international relations nerds, which I count myself one. But what about the other folks who don't necessarily understand nuclear proliferation sanctions and the importance of these countries? So could you put into sort of a somewhat of a context of how these things can affect Americans, when we're dealing with public health problems, as you said, economic downturn, does to the American who's not paying attention to international relations, does North Korea matter and does Iran matter, and why?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially during the current situation where we're all trying to get through this period of a global pandemic, it's really tough to argue that Iran and North Korea should be priorities, especially when so many people are out of work or are struggling, don't have health insurance and so forth. I get that. But at the same time, I really think it's important to at least be aware that these other issues are out there for the very reason, simple reason of we need to have a say in how we expend our country's resources, financially, but also our government's time, diplomatically. And when you look at these issues, if we have a spiraling of conflict with a country like Iran or North Korea, think how much of those resources that will take up. I mean, just look at the two wars that we're currently still engaged in the Middle East over the last 20 years, both Iraq, where we still have troops, and Afghanistan, where we also still have troops, and how much resources that has taken away from us. I mean, imagine if we had spent the trillions of dollars that we've put into those conflicts, which are unwinnable, by the way, and instead invested them into a pandemic response, invested it into building infrastructure here in the United States or education. So that's why I think I would make the case that these issues do affect the average American, because if you look at the United States' budget, it's one big pie, and how we spend it, we all should have a say in that. So that's the big picture. And I would also throw climate change in there. I know you're in the Midwest and are experiencing climate change, effects. Here in New York, where I am, rising sea level is a big concern for us. More storms is another concern. So we have to think about how we devote our limited resources, and how we vote is very important, who our representatives are in both Congress and in the executive branch, because after all, they will be making these decisions for us. So in the case of, North Korea, if we get back to a point where the tensions are ratcheted up, you can imagine if two nuclear weapon states engage in a conflict and one decides to use a nuclear weapon, what could happen then? And in the case of Iran, we actually did come close to having an all-out war with Iran earlier this year. The Iranians, we've been engaged in tit-for-tat provocations for some time now, since we've gotten out of the JCPOA. Iran struck Saudi oil facilities, at least that's what we think, that they were behind it. And in exchange, then we did something, and we killed Soleimani, and then they did a military strike against bases in Iraq where our troops were housed. So we came very close to that escalating into an all-out war. And if that happens, it's really hard to imagine that being contained to a small area. It could spiral into a broader regional war. We have a lot of troops there that could be sucked in. So there are connections, and it may seem like this is distant and we shouldn't be concerned about them. But if you really think about it, how we as a country engage with the rest of the world really affects all of us.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I've often told my students that, stop and think about where World War I began, in this little place called Sarajevo that nobody knew anything about at the time, really. So yeah, you never know. There's that butterfly effect. So I've got another question here. The question is the nuclear program in each of these countries the only thing on the table, or are there other objectives, fears on both sides that need to be addressed that could settle tensions? And how would you weigh those? So could we leave aside the nuclear issue and deal with some other issues and settle things down? Or what else is going on, and what's important, most important?
Right. So in the case of Iran, there are a lot of troubling issues on the table. Iran's activities with Hezbollah in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq. The list goes on in Syria, activities that are destabilizing and frankly undermine our interests too, but especially the regions. But the powers that did the JCPOA got together and decided of all these issues, which one is the most pressing, and they rightfully landed on nuclear. They came to the conclusion that preventing Iran from ever obtaining a nuclear weapon had to be the #1 priority, because if you think about it, if Iran was allowed to do that, it could set off a reaction where other powers in the region would want to seek nuclear weapons. We could imagine the Saudis wanting nuclear, the Turks, and then we'd have a nuclear arms race that could get out of control. It could open up the door to a military strikes on Iran's nuclear program by Israel or other countries, which could lead to a war too. So they decided to focus on nuclear. Let's get this program under control and then use it to build dialogue on other issues. Well, before we were able to get there, we pulled out of the deal. So we never really fully tested the prospect of engaging with the Iranians on a whole range of other issues. But Vice President Biden has made it clear if he's elected, he will get back in the deal and finally test that. So we'll have to see if that happens. In the case of North Korea, the nuclear program, as I said, the current administration's approach has been focused on only the nuclear program. That has been the main thing they're seeking, is total denuclearization of North Korea, which I think is a pipe dream at this moment. Can we work towards that or put it out as an end goal somewhere in the future? Yes, but for now, it's not going to happen. And at the expense, we have missed other opportunities to deal with North Korea on other issues. For example, could we reach an agreement with them where they provide us with assurances they won't sell their nuclear technology to terrorists, other third parties, other countries? That would be a negotiation worth pursuing. Could we have discussions with the North Koreans about finally ending the Korean War? Maybe some of your viewers aren't aware of this, but we are technically still in a state of war with the Koreans. We have an armistice in place, but we've never reached a full peace treaty. Could we have discussions on getting there? I think we should. And of course, that would have to include our allies, the South Koreans, the Chinese, the UN. So there are a lot of other things we can do. Humanitarian dialogue. You know, a lot of people are suffering because of sanctions imposed by us. Can we find a way to work with the North Koreans to alleviate some of that suffering, especially during this period of COVID? I think that's a discussion worth having too.
Here we go. Yeah, the impact of the sanctions, just knowing my own work, is in the humanitarian realm is can be quite devastating. And honestly, these are the cases where it's the worst. So I think that's a very interesting point. So a question specifically about the president. So if he's reelected, he says he wants to negotiate and make a deal with Iran. But do you think that Iran's willing to sit down with him? And I'm going to sort of extend this over and, you know, ask the same question about North Korea. Our president has shown a certain level of erratic nature in some of his tweets and things like that. And pulling out of the JCPOA is obviously doesn't make him a popular man in Tehran. So what do you think?
Well, he's unpopular in Tehran, but you know, there are many people against the current regime in Tehran. I mean, I don't think anyone loves them. So the question is the current approach working? You know sanctions quite well, and there are tough sanctions against Iran as any country, and yet the Iranians are not bending. They have decided to pursue a course they call the resistance economy, where yes, they're not allowed to sell their oil at the level they were. They'll find other ways to get by. As I mentioned before, Trump has said that if he's reelected, he'll have a deal in 3 weeks. I did express some skepticism on that. It really depends on Trump himself. If he decides he really wants to reach a deal with the Iranians, he's going to have to agree to sanctions release. I really think it's going to be nearly impossible to imagine the Iranians coming back to the table without some concessions on the sanctions. And so far, we haven't seen that yet. But again, in the second term, he may want to have these accomplishments under his belt. He may want to go for that Nobel Peace Prize that he really, really wants. And that would be a good place to start. But it's very difficult because the Iranians have decided that this administration really is looking for regime change. It's not negotiations, but really wants this regime gone. And I think it's difficult to negotiate with another country that you know wants to kill you. Now, in the case of North Korea, Kim and Trump, for as little progress has been made, I think in some respects you have to give some credit that he broke the taboo of meeting with the leader of North Korea. So no matter what happens, whether it's a second Trump administration or a Biden administration, I hope the idea of meeting directly with your adversaries isn't thrown out the window. I think we need to keep pursuing it, but we need to have a strategy in place that's realistic, as I said. So again, if the second Trump administration really wants to reach a deal, they're going to have to reassess their goals. And here again, I think demanding that North Korea suddenly agree to give up its nuclear program lock, stock, and barrel, they're not going to do it because, as I explained, they see it as the only thing that's stopping us from invading them, from decapitating Kim Jong-un. And by the way, when we killed Qasem Soleimani, the head of Iran's Quds Force, the North Koreans did not take that well. I mean, they saw a big official of an adversary country being killed by us. And that is one of their worst fears. That's one of Kim Jong-un's worst fears, is that we will do something similar to him. So I think we have a long way to go there. And unless we're prepared to move from our current negotiating position and convince them to do the same, I don't see us getting far.
I think it's so valuable that you pointed out the perspective of the North Koreans, because I think it's easy to, without considering that, think that they're being irrational or bad, but from their perspective, they're trying to stay alive. And honestly, they have good reason when you point out all of the cases where, you know, Gaddafi and others, Hussein. So they're not crazy to think that.
No, and when I've been in Pyongyang meeting with North Korean officials, they really go on and on about this, their fear of being suffering the same fate as Muammar Gaddafi. And I'm sure if I went back there now, they'd say something similar about Qasem Soleimani. So this is a real issue in their mind that's not going to be overcome easily. And that's why I think the only way forward is a real incremental approach over time, not necessarily build a huge amount of trust, because that might be not possible, but getting to a place where we can make some incremental progress, where we do something, they do something, and then so forth. We need to get into that space.
So one person asked a follow-up here. Let's see here. Another speaker may have suggested that the reason North Korea wouldn't give up its nuclear weapons is because they built up a national identity around those weapons, and the criticism around Trump. So that has become part of their national identity. And I would add into there, do you think that even meeting with Kim effectively gave him even more legitimacy or power within his own country?
First, let me tackle the issue of prestige, because I think that is a very good point, that the listener brought up. I mean, when you think about why North Korea has invested so much of its resources in this nuclear program, while so many people, frankly, have starved, of course, what I described is essential security, regime security. But the second is prestige. And, when you go to North Korea and spend some time in Pyongyang, it's really all about the prestige of this ruling family now, this dynastic regime, Kim Jong-un, his father and his grandfather. It is a cult of personality built around that. And the fact that Kim himself has managed to do what his grandfather and father couldn't, was really build this program to where it is today. And the missile program, by the way, the means to actually deliver those nuclear weapons is really quite an accomplishment and something that you hear about wherever you go. So prestige is a big factor as well. And I really agree with the listener that that makes it even more difficult to imagine them giving up. So what I'm suggesting is not that North Koreans will give up their program next week, next year, or maybe even 10 years from now. What I'm suggesting is we get into a process of negotiation where the threat of North Korea can be lessened, where we can maybe make some changes to our relationship to make that nuclear program less threatening to us. Are there some caps we could place? Could they stop producing uranium enrichment? Could they stop making more nuclear bombs? Those are the sorts of things I'm talking about, more pragmatic. And that will take time, and it'll also take compromise. They're not going to do this unless we move forward on a few ways. One is some sanctions relief. Another might be really declaring an end to the war. Maybe even finding ways to exchange diplomatic offices. We set up a liaison office in Pyongyang, and they do something in Washington. These are the sort of steps that we need to be taking.
Excellent. So shifting our focus a little bit, since the politics of the Middle East has turned to a concern from Palestine to Turkey and Iran after the Abraham Accords, is it now in the national interest to return to the Iranian nuclear deal?
Yes, I would argue yes. I mean, I understand that these deals that have been worked out between Israel and UAE and Israel and Bahrain really further isolate the Iranians. But that shouldn't stop us from, again, putting a lid on Iran's nuclear program. Right now, as I mentioned, Iran is outside of its restrictions of the JCPOA. They're producing more enriched uranium. They're stockpiling it. The time to create a bomb has probably lessened. Before this gets out of hand, we should rein that program back in, because you can imagine if they get to a point where they go full throttle, how disruptive and destabilizing it would be for the region. The other thing I would add here is I also think whether it's the second Trump administration or a Biden administration, we really need to reassess our relations with the region and maybe look to balance them better. Trump and his family infamously really went all in by pursuing stronger relations with Saudi Arabia, and they're a little bit imbalanced now. I think the United States should be playing the role more of a moderator in the region, not as taking the side of one group against the other. If we could get to a point where we could encourage, for example, the Saudis and the Iranians to pursue regional dialogue, and the GCC countries in general and the Iranians, to work out their differences, to learn to live with each other, to find ways. Because keep in mind, we don't have a regional security institution or architecture in that part of the world to help manage conflicts. I think that would be a project that these countries should be building themselves. We shouldn't be doing it for them by any means. We should be encouraging them to do that. If you look at all of the current conflicts in the region, whether it's Yemen, what's happening in Syria, even Iraq, and so forth, um, a lot of times the solution runs through Saudi and Iran. And until we can get to some modus vivendi, some understanding that these countries can live with each other and find ways to manage these conflicts, I don't see us making any progress. We, the United States alone, cannot do it. A military force cannot do it. So these are the sorts of, this is the diplomatic initiatives I think we should be pursuing. And getting back in the nuclear deal, we will have more leverage against the Iranians to persuade them to take this route. And that's one of the reasons why I support us getting back into the deal.
Thank you. So we'll turn away from Trump for a minute and talk about Joe Biden. Do you know what's, if any, sort of specific plans or policies that the Biden administration would have toward North Korea and Iran? And then a related question, how difficult will it be for a President Biden to develop those relationships and be able to engage those countries? President Trump is now a known entity to them. President Biden is not yet known.
Well, I think it's going to be a bit easier on the Iran file for the Biden administration, simply because unlike North Korea, President Trump has not had a good relationship with the Iranians. I think the Iranians, by and large, are looking forward to a Biden administration rather than a Trump 2 administration. And as I said, Vice President Biden himself already has declared an intention to get back into the JCPOA. Also, by the way, the Paris Accord on climate, extending New START. So getting us back into the international agreements that we've walked away from during the Trump administration, he's making that a priority. It's not going to be uncomplicated by any means. I think the best way forward is for us to just go back into the deal, say we're going to get back into compliance, which means lowering the nuclear sanctions, and that the Iranians get back into compliance with the deal on their end, which means stopping the excess enrichment and other nuclear activities they're undertaking, and then take it from there. So what makes me a little bit optimistic there is the stated intention by both the Iranians and the Biden team to do this. They stated that they would like to do this. And there's a mechanism in place already to do this. And keep in mind, the deal is still alive. The Europeans have tried to keep it alive, the Chinese, the Russians. So there's a mechanism, a framework in place waiting for that to be done. We don't have that luxury with North Korea. We don't have a treaty, an agreement in place. We have something from the first summit called the Singapore Declaration, which isn't so much an agreement. I would call it more a statement of principle, which says we agree to change the fundamental nature of our relationship from less hostility to something less contentious, from hostile to less contentious. We agree to work on developing a peace regime on the peninsula, and we agree to find ways to deal with North Korea's nuclear program. That's a starting point, and if Biden wins, I hope he wouldn't throw that out the window. I hope he wouldn't say, this is something Trump accomplished, I don't want to have anything to do with it. I think that would be very short-sighted, because after all, Kim Jong-un's signature is on that document. If I was working for the Biden administration, I would go to North Korea with that document and say, let's use this as a starting point for negotiations.
Excellent, thank you. Well, I think that we've run out of time, and happily, I think we've answered all the questions. So Matthew, I think I turn it back to you, is that correct?
That's great, Cooper. And thanks so much to you and Suzanne for a really interesting conversation about, as Suzanne said, two very, very different cases in nuclear proliferation, in diplomacy, and international relations. So, Suzanne, thank you so much for your insight this evening, for joining us. We would love to have you out in Kansas City when all of this passes. And Cooper, you're just down the road, so we'll look forward to seeing you before too long as well. Everyone, we have just 1 week left in our Choices Election Issues series. And each week as we count down, that means that the election, in fact, is getting closer. So just 2 weeks away from tonight, we will have Una Hathaway from Yale Law School joining us to talk about American leadership and multilateralism, which is a really nice coda for this 8-week series, sort of bringing together a lot of the threads and themes that we've been examining throughout. Thank you again to our supporting series sponsors, Nancy C. Messer, the University of Missouri, and Buttonwood Financial Group, and to our sponsors for this evening's program, Avila University and Cyprian Simkowitz and Jerry White. We wish you all a pleasant evening, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Take care.